is a talk about Harberger tax, and it's a very simple idea where you basically change property rights to rebalance the tension between communal ownership and private ownership toward more type of communal ownership. And why would you want to do that? That is what I will go into later. But the reason that people do it is that it makes the allocation of resources more efficient in one sense that could matter to you, and less efficient in another sense, so you have to keep balance that. The Harberger tax is a tax that you pay on property that you own when you estimate how valuable it is. You are forced to estimate the value of this property. So for example, I have a house and I'm saying that this house is worth $100,000. Then I have to pay a certain tax rate on that estimate that I make myself. In the examples here, they use 7%. That is some sort of ideal measure according to certain calculations. So then I would have to pay $7,000 a year property tax on being the owner of this $100,000 house. But if anybody walks up to me and says, okay, you say your house is worth $100,000, here's $100,000, it's now my house. So you are forced to sell at the price that you estimate your property to be at. And I would say it's like similar to that game or that situation where when you're a kid and you have a brother or a sister and there's a piece of pie that needs to be divided up, and so like you getting a bigger piece, and then one kid has to cut the pie and the other kid gets to choose which part he wants, and then make sure that they get a fair division, right? So I think this is an extension of that idea. It's like if you really want to avoid your property tax, then you can estimate your property to be worth almost nothing. But then anybody can say, well, I think that your property is worth more. I can make that more productive. Like suppose it's not a house that you live in, but a capital asset for a business. Then this automatically leads to a situation where every piece of property is owned by the person who can make that the most productive. So the allocative efficiency is optimal. Now, in this this is an idea that's introduced in this paper here. They later wrote a book about this, like a broader set of concepts that are in the same family. So this book is called Radical Markets. They talk about roughly these 5 different ideas, and one of them, the first one they talk about is this Harberger tax. And it comes from the criticism that they start with. Here's this title, Property is a Monopoly. So what do you get if you have traditional property rights like we mostly are familiar with, is that it's possible for someone to hold on to an asset and not make it all that productive and just say like, I want a really high price for this thing because I like it. I'm going to speculate on this piece of land over here because 5 years from now there's going to be a hyperloop. And then you will have to pay through the nose to actually build your train track or your railroad or whatever, you know? And so you are actually acting like a monopolist there, and as we know from Economics 101, when there's a monopoly, that's not actually a very efficient thing. Like they get a larger share of the wealth in the trade, in the advantage between the customer and the producer. The monopolist is actually acting sort of in an unfair way. He's abusing his economic power, right? So they extend that consensus around what it means to be a monopolist into even private property. So you could say like, I'm not selling this land, I'm just keeping it, you know? And then somebody else could say, well, we can make this land productive. This can serve the community. This can make everybody richer. You know, the total surplus, the total amount of wealth in the world would be better if you use this productively, and I can use it productively, but you are holding on to it. So that is the solution to that problem. The allocative efficiency in the economy would be greater if you have this Harberger tax concept.
Do you think it can be abused?
So the problem is that you...
Let's say I want to move you out of your house, I have a lot of money, and you have to say yes. So I'm going to offer you a price whichever above market price to get your property, because I want to move you out of it for whichever reason. I don't
well,
like
then you get a lot of money, right?
What?
Like, suppose, how is that abusive? Like, if suppose that we both agree that this is a good property rights system, and I live in a country or a jurisdiction where this exists, right? Then, and somebody wants to have me out of my house, they will have to pony up the cash to do that. So it's fair in that sense, right? If they can afford to.
Right. So if you really don't want to move out of your place, no matter what, you're gonna set high value of it and pay high taxes to live there.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So and then it really distorts the word like your house, because that is the problem. It's no longer really your house. It's a communal property that is optimized towards some sort of notion of productivity. And this was also like I tested this idea, explained this idea to my girlfriend, for example, and she already had a lot of like her instincts about fairness and security for property and everything. They all went right out and said like, look, this is a horrible system. This is terrible. So, and I played devil's advocate, and I mostly agree. Like I think that at least instinctually, also my sense of property rights is also violated by this idea. Like I don't think I should be in a position where I might have to leave my house right now, this minute, just because somebody gives me money, right? It changes your relationship to property, and that brings me to the drawback of the system, and that is that you have less investment efficiency. So you have allocated efficiency, the person that makes the most productive, but if I am going to possibly be losing my house, my property, my factory, my machines like next year, then maybe I will not take all that much care of them. So it is distorting my sense of ownership and investment. So this is the drawback of it. And now let's just bring this back to what we're talking about. We are talking about Ethereum, right? So Vitalik Buterin wrote a review essentially of this book or this idea. He has it over here, like on relevant markets. He mostly talks about this this idea, and here this is a funny picture that he found with it. Like this is the sort of problem that you avoid with a Harberger text. And so obviously this guy was not willing to sell to the people that built that highway. In the Netherlands specifically, I know that they solved this problem with government coercion. They say, look, we're going to build this railroad, and the railroad is going to be very straight, and your vineyard is on, or like your apple trees are on the railroad, so you will have to sell, but we will give you 2 or 3 times the market value of it. So somebody makes an assessment, says that the market says this is probably worth this much, and then you get 2 or 3 times as much. So you are forced to sell, but you are adequately compensated.
So we are paying for that guy, because
yeah. That's and that is how I think a lot of Western democracies currently solve this problem. So that's but apparently in the country where they built this highway, they have a different idea about property rights. So this is Vitalik talking. Okay, so this might be a little bit esoteric for the people that didn't do economics 101, but this is one other concept that Mr. Harberger came up with that sort of ties into this idea that the efficiency of the economy as a whole would be improved, and that is this little triangle over here. So if you conceive of traditional property as being a monopolistic situation, then you will lose the benefit of the consumer, that is this part, and it will be distorted. So like I don't want to spend too much time on this, it's very specialist, but if you stare at this graph long enough, then you understand what the benefits for society would be in the ideal situation if we organize property in this way. So now, of course, as Ethereum developers, you guys might want to ask yourself, like, how can I implement this on Ethereum or in a blockchain situation, right? So I've been doing some free association on that for myself, and this guy also, he wrote a bit more about it. He actually created a smart contract that defines this concept of a Harberger tax. So you can create an asset on the blockchain that has this code running. Here are some examples of use cases. You could fund art with it, you could have a continuous auction, intellectual property. I didn't go into the details of this specifically because I was personally mostly interested in thought experiment what would happen if you have virtual property rights. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this 2 years ago when I was working on this project called Beachhead, where we have a virtual reality world where there is scarce property and people have to pay tax to get the right to use this property, and the tax is used as a payment for the virtual army that is defending the city in a virtual game war. So, but there is this situation that the entrepreneur that makes the most use of the virtual real estate will be automatically owning it, because they are the ones that are first going to take the risk on occupying it and then try to make it productive. And if they cannot afford to pay the tax, then they will be incentivized to sell to somebody who can. So we already have this crude version of this Harberger tax in this game situation, but now I'm thinking like we could probably implement a much more clean version of it in a new situation.